American philosophy is the philosophical activity or output of Americans, both within the United States and abroad. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that while American philosophy lacks a core of defining features, American philosophy can nevertheless be seen as both reflecting and shaping collective American identity over the history of the nation. The political thinker and historian Alexis De Tocqueville gave his own more detailed definition of a philosophical method among the Americans, in the opening paragraph of Book 2 of Democracy in America. I think that in no country in the civilized world is less attention paid to philosophy than in the United States. Nevertheless, it is easy to perceive that almost all the inhabitants of the United States conduct their understanding in the same manner, and govern it by the same rules, that is to say, that without ever having taken the trouble to define the rules of a philosophical method, they are in possession of one, common to the whole people. To evade the bondage of system and habit, of family maxims, class opinions, and, in some degree, of national prejudices, to accept tradition only as a means of information, and existing facts only as a lesson used in doing otherwise, and doing better, to seek the reason of things for oneself, and in one's self alone, to tend to results without being bound to means, and to aim at the substance through the form. Such are the principal characteristics of what I shall call the philosophical method of the Americans. In most of the operations of the mind, each American appeals to the individual exercise of his own understanding alone. 17th century. The American philosophical tradition began at the time of the European colonization of the New World. The Puritans' arrival in New England set the earliest American philosophy into the religious tradition, and there was also an emphasis on the relationship between the individual and the community. This is evident by the early colonial documents such as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Thinkers such as John Winthrop emphasize the public life over the private, holding that the former takes precedence over the latter, while other writers, such as Roger Williams, held that religious tolerance was more integral than trying to achieve religious homogeneity in a community. 18th century. 18th century American philosophy may be broken into two halves. The first half being marked by the theology of Reformed Puritan Calvinism influenced by the Great Awakening as well as Enlightenment natural philosophy, and the second by the native moral philosophy of the American Enlightenment taught in American colleges. They were used, in the tumultuous years of the 1760s and 1770s, to forge a new intellectual culture for the United States, which led to the American incarnation of the European Enlightenment that is associated with the political thought of the Founding Fathers. The 18th century saw the introduction of Francis Bacon and the Enlightenment philosophers Descartes, Newton, Locke, Wollaston, and Berkeley to colonial British America. Two Native Americans, Samuel Johnson and Jonathan Edwards, were first influenced by these philosophers. They then adapted and extended their Enlightenment ideas to develop their own American theology and philosophy. Both were originally ordained Puritan Congregationalist ministers who embraced much of the new learning of the Enlightenment. Both were Yale-educated and Berkeley-influenced idealists who became influential college presidents. Both were influential in the development of American political philosophy and the works of the Founding Fathers. But Edwards based his Reformed Puritan theology on Calvinist doctrine, while Johnson converted to the Anglican Episcopal religion, then based his new American moral philosophy on William Wollaston's natural religion. Late in the century, Scottish innate or common-sense realism replaced the native schools of these two rivals in the college philosophy curricula of American colleges. It would remain the dominant philosophy in American academia up to the Civil War. The introduction of the Enlightenment into America. The first 100 years or so of college education in the American colonies were dominated in New England by the Puritan theology of William Ames and the 16th century logical methods of Petrus Ramus. Then in 1714, A donation of 800 books from England, collected by colonial agent Jeremiah Dummer, arrived at Yale. They contained what became known as the New Learning, including the works of Locke, Descartes, Newton, Boyle, and Shakespeare, and other Enlightenment-era authors not known to the tutors and graduates of Puritan Yale and Harvard colleges. They were first opened and studied by an 18-year-old graduate student from Guilford, Connecticut, the young American Samuel Johnson, who had also just found and read Lord Francis Bacon's Advancement of Learning. Johnson wrote in his autobiography, "All this was like a flood of day to his low state of mind, and that he found himself like one at once emerging out of the glimmer of twilight into the full sunshine of open day." He now considered what he had learned at Yale nothing but the scholastic cobwebs of a few little English and Dutch systems that would hardly now be taken up in the street. Johnson was appointed tutor at Yale in 1716. He began to teach the Enlightenment curriculum there, and thus began the American Enlightenment. One of his students for a brief time was a 15-year-old Jonathan Edwards. These two brilliant Yale students of those years, each of whom was to become a noted thinker and college president, exposed the fundamental nature of the problem, of the incongruities between the old learning and the new, but each had a quite different view on the issues of predestination versus free will, original sin versus the pursuit of happiness through practicing virtue, and the education of children. Reformed Calvinism. Jonathan Edwards is considered to be America's most important and original philosophical theologian, noted for his energetic sermons, such as "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Edwards emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God and the beauty of God's holiness, working to unite Christian Platonism with an empiricist epistemology. With the aid of Newtonian physics, Edwards was deeply influenced by George Berkeley, himself an empiricist, and Edwards derived his importance of the immaterial for the creation of human experience from Bishop Berkeley. The non-material mind consists of understanding and will, and it is understanding, interpreted in a Newtonian framework, that leads to Edwards' fundamental metaphysical category of resistance. Whatever features an object may have, it has these properties because the object resists. Resistance itself is the exertion of God's power, and it can be seen in Newton's laws of motion. Where an object is unwilling to change its current state of motion, an object at rest will remain at rest and an object in motion will remain in motion. Though Edwards reformed Puritan theology using Enlightenment ideas from natural philosophy, and Locke, Newton, and Berkeley, he remained a Calvinist and hard determinist. Jonathan Edwards also rejected the freedom of the will, saying that, "We can do as we please, but we cannot please as we please." According to Edwards, neither good works nor self-originating faith lead to salvation, but rather it is the unconditional grace of God which stands as the sole arbiter of human fortune. The age of the American Enlightenment. While the 17th and early 18th century American philosophical tradition was decidedly marked by religious themes, and the Reformation reason of Ramus, the 18th century saw more reliance on science and the new learning of the Age of Enlightenment, along with an idealist belief in the perfectibility of human beings through teaching ethics and moral philosophy, laissez-faire economics, and a new focus on political matters. Samuel Johnson has been called the founder of American philosophy, and the first important philosopher in colonial America and author of the first philosophy textbook published there. He was interested not only in philosophy and theology, but in theories of education, and in knowledge classification schemes, which he used to write encyclopedias, develop college curricula, and create library classification systems. Johnson was a proponent of the view that the essence of true religion is morality, and believed that the problem of denominationalism could be solved by teaching a non-denominational common moral philosophy acceptable to all religions. So he crafted one. Johnson's moral philosophy was influenced by Descartes and Locke. but more directly by William Wollaston's Religion of Nature delineated, and the idealist philosopher of George Berkeley, with whom Johnson studied while Berkeley was in Rhode Island, between 1729 and 1731. Johnson strongly rejected Calvin's doctrine of predestination and believed that people were autonomous moral agents endowed with free will and Lockean natural rights. His fusion philosophy of natural religion and idealism, which has been called American practical idealism, was developed as a series of college textbooks in 7 editions between 1731 and 1754. These works, and his dialogue Raphael, or The Genius of the English America, written at the time of the Stamp Act crisis, go beyond his Wollaston and Berkeley influences. Raphael includes sections on economics, psychology, the teaching of children, and political philosophy. His moral philosophy is defined in his college textbook Element of Philosophica as the art of pursuing our highest happiness by the practice of virtue. It was promoted by President Thomas Clapp of Yale, Benjamin Franklin and Provost William Smith at the Academy and College of Philadelphia, and taught at King's College, which Johnson founded in 1754. It was influential in its day. It has been estimated that about half of American college students between 1743 and 1776, and over half of the men who contributed to the Declaration of Independence or debated it were connected to Johnson's American practical idealism, moral philosophy. 3 members of the Committee of 5 who edited the Declaration of Independence were closely connected to Johnson. His educational partner, promoter, friend, and publisher Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, his King's College student Robert R. Livingston of New York, and his son William Samuel Johnson's legal protege and Yale treasurer Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Johnson's son William Samuel Johnson was the chairman of the Committee of Style that wrote the U.S. Constitution. Edits to a draft version are in his hand in the Library of Congress. The political philosophy of the founders about the time of the Stamp Act. Interest rose in civil and political philosophy. Many of the Founding Fathers wrote extensively on political issues, including John Adams, John Dickinson, Alexander Hamilton, John J. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison. In continuing with the chief concerns of the Puritans in the 17th century, the Founding Fathers debated the interrelationship between God, the state, and the individual. Resulting from this were the United States Declaration of Independence, passed in 1776, and the United States Constitution, ratified in 1788. The Constitution sets forth a federated republican form of government that is marked by a balance of powers accompanied by a checks and balances system between the 3 branches of government: a judicial branch, an executive branch led by the president, and a legislative branch composed of a bicameral legislature where the House of Representatives is the lower house and the Senate is the upper house. While the Declaration of Independence does contain within it references to the Creator, the God of nature, divine providence, and the supreme judge of the world, the Founding Fathers were not exclusively theistic. Some professed personal concepts of deism, as was characteristic of other European Enlightenment thinkers, such as Maximilien Robespierre, François-Marie Arouet, and Rousseau. However, an investigation of 106 contributors to the Declaration of Independence between September 5, 1774 and July 4, 1776 found only 2 men, both American practical idealists in their moral philosophy, might be called quasi-deists or non-denominational Christians. All the others were publicly members of denominational Christian churches. Even Franklin professed the need for a public religion, and would attend various churches from time to time. Jefferson was vestryman at the Evangelical Calvinistical Reformed Church of Charlottesville, Virginia, a church he himself founded and named in 1777, suggesting that at this time of life he was rather strongly affiliated with the denomination. and that the influence of Whitefield and Edwards reached even into Virginia. But the founders who studied or embraced Johnson, Franklin, and Smith's non-denominational moral philosophy were at least influenced by the deistic tendencies of Wollaston's natural region, as evidenced by the laws of nature, and nature's God, and the pursuit of happiness, in the Declaration, an alternate moral philosophy to the domestic American practical idealism, called variously Scottish innate-sense moral philosophy, Scottish common-sense philosophy, or Scottish common-sense realism, was introduced into American colleges in 1768 by John Witherspoon, a Scottish immigrant and educator who was invited to be president of the College of New Jersey. He was a Presbyterian minister, and a delegate who joined the Continental Congress just days before the Declaration was debated. His moral philosophy was based on the work of the Scottish philosopher Francis Hutcheson, who also influenced John Adams. When President Witherspoon arrived at the College of New Jersey in 1768, he expanded its natural philosophy offerings, purged the Berkeley adherents from the faculty, including Jonathan Edwards, Jr., and taught his own Hutcheson-influenced form of Scottish innate-sense moral philosophy. Some revisionist commentators, including Gary Will's Inventing America, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, claimed in the 1970s that this imported Scottish philosophy was the basis for the founding documents of America. However, other historians have questioned this assertion. Ronald Hamowy published a critique of Gary Will's Inventing America, concluding that, the moment Will's statements are subjected to scrutiny, they appear a mass of confusions, uneducated guesses, and blatant errors of fact. Another investigation of all of the contributors to the United States Declaration of Independence suggests that only Jonathan Witherspoon and John Adams embraced the imported Scottish morality, while Scottish innate-sense realism would, in the decades after the Revolution, become the dominant moral philosophy in classrooms of American academia. For almost 100 years, it was not a strong influence at the time of the Declaration was crafted. Johnson's American practical idealism and Edwards' Reformed Puritan Calvinism were far stronger influences on the men of the Continental Congress and on the Declaration. Thomas Paine, the English intellectual, pamphleteer, and revolutionary who wrote Common Sense and Rights of Man, was an influential promoter of Enlightenment political ideas in America, though he was not a philosopher. Common Sense, which has been described as the most incendiary and popular pamphlet of the entire Revolutionary era, provides justification for the American Revolution and independence from the British Crown.